It is the morning of September 20th, 1863, and the deep, primeval forests of northern Georgia are choked with a blinding, terrifying mixture of white fog and black powder smoke. Inside this dense, tangled wilderness, Union Major General William S. Rosecrans is vibrating with a frantic, manic energy. He is the commander of the Army of the Cumberland, but right now, he looks less like a conquering hero and more like a man teetering on the absolute edge of a psychological cliff. He has not slept in a proper bed in nearly a week. His uniform is rumpled, his eyes are bloodshot and wild, and his mind is racing at 1,000 miles an hour. He is constantly snapping at his exhausted staff officers, frantically scribbling his own dispatch orders, and literally riding along the battle lines to personally dictate the placement of individual artillery pieces. Rosecrans is an exhausted genius. He is undeniably one of the most brilliant strategic minds in the United States military, a man who views warfare as an incredibly complex, high-stakes game of chess. But his fatal flaw is his absolute, paralyzing inability to let go. He is a micromanager of the highest, most destructive order. He looks at his massive army of 60,000 men. He looks at the blinding fog of the Georgia woods, and he basically says, "If I do not personally control every single piece on this board, the entire army will collapse." But by desperately trying to control everything, he is actively blinding himself. If you're ready for the real story, hit that subscribe button and let's get back to the front lines. So here's the situation. Throughout the summer of 1863, while the nation was entirely focused on the carnage at Gettysburg and Vicksburg, William Rosecrans executed an absolute masterclass of military maneuvering in Tennessee. Using brilliant feints, rapid marches, and sheer logistical genius, he completely outmaneuvered the Confederate Army of Tennessee, commanded by General Braxton Bragg. Rosecrans pushed the Confederates out of Middle Tennessee and forced them to abandon the incredibly vital railroad hub of Chattanooga, all without fighting a single major battle. The Northern press hailed Rosecrans as a tactical god. He had captured the gateway to the Deep South with barely a casualty. Rosecrans is currently riding a wave of massive, unchecked confidence. He genuinely believes he has broken the spirit of the Confederate Army. When his scouts report that Bragg's forces are moving south into the dense mountains of northern Georgia, Rosecrans assumes they are in a full, panicked retreat. He divides his massive army into 3 separate columns and sends them plunging blindly into the rugged mountain passes, desperate to catch the fleeing rebels and crush them for good. But Braxton Bragg isn't running. He is furious, he is heavily reinforced, and he is setting a massive, devastating trap. Bragg halts his retreat just south of Chattanooga, in a densely wooded valley along the banks of a slow-moving, dark waterway called West Chickamauga Creek. The name Chickamauga is often translated from the local Cherokee dialect as the River of Death. It is a fitting name. The terrain here is an absolute nightmare for a conventional 19th century army. It is a suffocating, primeval forest of thick pine, tangled cedar thickets, and dense underbrush. You cannot see 50 yards in front of your own face. You cannot maintain linear battle formations. Artillery is practically useless because there are no open fields of fire. It is the absolute worst place on planet Earth for a micromanager to fight a battle, because the fog of war is completely literal. When Rosecrans finally realizes that Bragg has turned around and is preparing to attack, the Union commander panics. He frantically orders his 3 scattered columns to desperately march north and reconsolidate before the Confederates can destroy them piecemeal. It is a terrifying, exhausting race against time. For days and nights, the Union soldiers force march over brutal mountain roads, heavily sleep-deprived and running on adrenaline. Rosecrans himself is awake around the clock, pushing his body and his mind to the absolute breaking point, trying to stitch his army back together in the dark. By September 19th, the 2 massive armies violently collide in the woods. The first day of the Battle of Chickamauga is a chaotic, blind slugfest. There is no grand strategy. Divisions simply stumble into each other in the thick brush and open fire at point-blank range. The noise is deafening, the smoke is blinding, and the command structure on both sides completely breaks down. Regiments are fighting isolated, desperate battles for survival. Rosecrans spends the entire day in a state of manic hypervigilance, frantically shifting brigades back and forth across his battle line to plug real and imagined holes. By the time night falls, the Union Army has barely managed to hold its ground. This brings us back to the morning of September 20th. The Union Army is exhausted, bleeding, and heavily entrenched behind hastily built log breastworks. Rosecrans is standing at his headquarters, a small log cabin behind the lines. His mind is practically vibrating out of his skull. He has survived the first day, but he knows Bragg is going to attack again. Think about it. Imagine you are William Rosecrans. You are running on zero sleep. Your nervous system is fried. You are responsible for the lives of tens of thousands of men, but you cannot actually see them because they are swallowed by the forest. You are relying entirely on the frantic, breathless reports of staff officers galloping out of the smoke. You are terrified of a breakthrough. Your brain, starved of rest, is no longer processing information logically. It is simply reacting to fear. Suddenly, a Union staff officer gallops up to the headquarters. He is out of breath and his horse is covered in foam. He reports to Rosecrans that he has just ridden down the line and spotted a massive, terrifying problem. He claims there is a gaping hole in the Union defenses. He says that the division commanded by General Joseph J. Reynolds is not physically connected to the division commanded by General John M. Brannan. Here is the catch. The staff officer is entirely wrong. There is no gap. General Brannan's division is sitting exactly where it is supposed to be. But the woods are so incredibly thick, and the smoke is so heavy, that the staff officer simply rode past them without seeing them. He took a superficial glance at the tangled brush, panicked, and rode back to headquarters with catastrophic misinformation. If Rosecrans were rested, if he were thinking clearly, he would pause. He would look at his map. He would send another officer to visually verify this supposed gap before tearing his battle line apart. But Rosecrans is not thinking clearly. The exhausted genius hears the word gap, and his frayed mind instantly snaps into micromanagement mode. He doesn't verify the information. He doesn't ask questions. He immediately grabs a piece of paper and scribbles an order directly to Brigadier General Thomas J. Wood, whose division is stationed further down the line. Rosecrans writes the most infamous, disastrously worded dispatch of the entire American Civil War. He hastily scribbles, "The general commanding directs that you close up on Reynolds as fast as possible and support him." It is a fatal typo of the mind. Rosecrans meant to tell Wood to shift over and fill the empty space. But because he didn't realize Brannan's men were already occupying that space, the order makes absolutely no logistical sense. You cannot close up on someone and support them at the same time if another massive division of troops is sitting directly between you. Wait, it gets worse. Here is where the gritty reality of human ego and military friction collide in the most devastating way imaginable. A courier gallops down the line and hands this hastily scribbled piece of paper to General Thomas J. Wood. Wood reads the order. He looks out at the dense woods, and he knows with absolute undeniable certainty that the commanding general is wrong. Wood can physically see Brannan's division sitting right next to him. He knows there is no gap. More importantly, Wood knows that if he obeys this order, he will have to pull his entire division of 4,000 men out of their fortified trenches, march them behind Brannan, and physically create a massive quarter-mile-wide hole in the center of the Union battle line. It is tactical suicide. Any first-year cadet at West Point would look at that order and realize it is a catastrophic mistake. So why doesn't Wood ignore it? Why doesn't he send a courier back to Rosecrans to clarify the mistake? To understand that, you have to look at what happened just a few hours earlier. Earlier that morning, Rosecrans was riding the lines in his manic state. He saw Wood's division slightly out of alignment. Instead of pulling Wood aside, Rosecrans lost his temper. He publicly screamed at Wood, berating him and deeply humiliating him in front of all his staff officers. He accused Wood of dragging his feet and explicitly threatened to relieve him of command if he ever hesitated to follow a direct order again. Now, Wood is holding a piece of paper that orders him to do something incredibly stupid. His pride is deeply, violently bruised. He is a professional soldier who has just been treated like a disobedient child. Wood looks at the paper, looks at the impending disaster, and his ego takes the wheel. He basically says, "I have my orders. The commanding general yelled at me for hesitating. If he wants me to march away and leave a gaping hole in our defenses, that is exactly what I will do." It is an act of sheer, malicious compliance. Wood values his own bruised ego more than the survival of the army. He turns to his brigade commanders and issues the fatal command. The men of Wood's division stand up. They sling their rifles over their shoulders. They abandon their heavy log breastworks, and they begin to march out of the line, leaving a massive, yawning void in the absolute center of the Union Army. The timing of this movement is a tragedy of almost supernatural proportions. At the exact, terrifying moment that Thomas J. Wood's last men are marching out of the trenches, the woods in front of them explode. The Confederates have spent the entire morning secretly massing an enormous strike force directly opposite this section of the line. General James Longstreet, recently arrived from Robert E. Lee's army in Virginia, has packed 11,000 hardened, screaming Confederate veterans into a massive, deep assault column. They don't know there is a hole in the Union line. They are just launching a blind, brute force assault into the trees, hoping to smash whatever is in front of them. Longstreet's massive, roaring column charges through the thick brush, their bayonets fixed, giving the high-pitched, terrifying rebel yell. They burst through the clearing and slam directly into the Union defenses. But they don't hit a wall of lead. By sheer, dumb, horrifying luck, the absolute center of Longstreet's 11,000-man spearhead hits the exact quarter-mile gap that Wood had vacated mere minutes before. It is not a battle. It is an instantaneous, catastrophic rupture. The Confederates pour through the empty space like a tidal wave crashing through a broken dam. They immediately turn left and right, firing devastating volleys directly into the exposed flanks and rear of the Union units on either side of the gap. The Union line does not just buckle. It instantly vaporizes. Imagine the sheer panic of the Union soldiers. They are fighting the enemy to their front, feeling secure behind their logs, when suddenly thousands of Confederates are screaming and shooting at them from behind. Complete, unadulterated terror sweeps through the woods. Brigades shatter. Men throw down their rifles and run for their lives. The entire right wing of the Army of the Cumberland disintegrates into a fleeing, terrified mob of blue uniforms, horses, and shattered artillery wagons rushing blindly toward the rear. We zoom back to William Rosecrans. The commanding general is still near his headquarters when the tidal wave of disaster hits. He hears the roar of the Confederate breakthrough. He looks up and sees his magnificent army, the army he had micromanaged, the army he had lost sleep over, the army he thought he completely controlled, running in absolute blind terror. The psychological shock is too much. The exhausted genius completely shatters. Observers and staff officers watch in horror as Rosecrans's manic energy instantly evaporates, replaced by a terrifying, catatonic numbness. The man who had been barking orders, frantically writing dispatches, and literally riding the lines to personally place cannons just hours before is now completely incapable of speaking. His face turns the color of cold ash. Think about it. Imagine you are Rosecrans in this exact moment. Your entire identity as a commander is built on intellectual superiority and absolute control. You are the grand chess master, and suddenly, someone has violently flipped the table over. The noise around him is deafening. The screams of dying men, the thunder of Confederate artillery, the frantic, terrifying clatter of runaway supply wagons. But inside Rosecrans's mind, everything goes completely, deadly silent. He looks at the tidal wave of gray uniforms pouring through the gap he accidentally created, and he essentially says, "The board is broken. The game is over." A devout Catholic, Rosecrans slowly, mechanically crosses himself. He makes no attempt to rally the fleeing men. He makes no attempt to establish a rear guard or shout orders over the din. The ultimate micromanager has shut down completely. He simply turns his horse around and rides away from the battlefield in a silent, dead-eyed daze, completely abandoning his army to the slaughter. Wait, it gets worse. He doesn't just ride safely to the rear. He is physically swept up in a terrified, bleeding mob of his own routed soldiers. The commanding general of the Army of the Cumberland joins the panic stampede all the way back to the city of Chattanooga. He is a broken man who will never hold a major field command again. Back in Washington, D.C., Abraham Lincoln is pacing the War Department telegraph office, reading the fragmented, hysterical reports coming in from the routed officers. Lincoln realizes his brilliant strategist has entirely lost his nerve. He notes with dark, profound despair that Rosecrans appeared, confused and stunned like a duck hit on the head. So here's the situation. The right wing is gone. The commander has fled. The Army of the Cumberland is on the brink of total, permanent annihilation. But they are saved by the stubborn, unbreakable will of one subordinate general. While Rosecrans and half the army flee in terror, Major General George H. Thomas refuses to run. Thomas is a massive, deliberate Virginian who stayed loyal to the Union. He is the exact psychological opposite of Rosecrans. He is methodical, calm, and utterly immovable. Thomas looks at the shattered, fleeing units rushing past him. He looks at the massive Confederate wave rolling through the woods, and he basically says, "We stop here. Not one step further." He gathers whatever retreating units he can find, stragglers, broken regiments, men separated from their officers, and physically forces them into a desperate, horseshoe-shaped defensive line on a wooded elevation called Snodgrass Hill. Thomas fights a horrific, bleeding rearguard action until nightfall. The fighting here is absolute, desperate savagery. Thomas's men run entirely out of ammunition. They are scavenging paper cartridges from the dead bodies of their friends. When the bullets are gone, Thomas orders them to fix bayonets and fight hand-to-hand with clubbed muskets. Thomas sits quietly on his massive horse, coolly directing the defense, standing firm against wave after wave of screaming Confederate assaults. His absolute refusal to break earns him the immortal, legendary nickname, the Rock of Chickamauga. He buys just enough precious time, paid for in blood, for the rest of the surviving army to escape the woods and limp into the fortifications of Chattanooga. But the damage is already done. The Battle of Chickamauga ends as the second bloodiest engagement of the entire Civil War, second only to Gettysburg, with over 34,000 casualties. The woods are choked with the dead and dying. Bragg has won a massive, undeniable tactical victory. And the nightmare isn't over. Bragg pursues the fleeing Union Army and surrounds the city of Chattanooga. He occupies the massive, towering heights of Lookout Mountain and Missionary Ridge, effectively cutting off every single Union supply line. The Union Army is trapped. They are starving. The soldiers are eating their own dying mules and stealing corn from the horses just to survive. The tragic resolution of this nightmare is a brutal lesson in the absolute limits of the human mind. Rosecrans lost the battle because he forgot the golden rule of military leadership. When you are exhausted, when the stakes are terrifying, and when you are fighting in the dark, you cannot micromanage the fog of war. You have to trust the men in the trenches. By trying to control every single piece on the board, Rosecrans blinded himself to the reality of the battlefield. His sleep-deprived paranoia, combined with the deeply bruised ego of a subordinate, created a fatal typo that killed thousands of men and nearly lost the entire Western theater of the war. The Union Army was broken, besieged, and starving in the freezing mud of Chattanooga. But as we know from the previous chapter of our history, Abraham Lincoln had finally found his sword. The president looked at the unmitigated disaster at Chickamauga, realized he needed a relentless brawler to fix the mess of the intellectual genius, and ordered Ulysses S. Grant to pack his bags and head to Tennessee.